In 2011, I staked my career on emulation. I just started working at the Internet Archive after a career in system administration, and I was asked to do something relatively impossible. The archive could supply movies, music, books, all range of media, and you could play it immediately in your browser. And Brewster Kahle, the founder of the Internet Archive, asked me, hey, could you maybe do that with software? And I knew that the solution in front of me was emulation, and that emulation would come through for me because emulation is magic. This is Jason Scott. You're listening to Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, stories, and getting out of debt. Huge thanks to Dan Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other Patreon supporters who are helping to make this happen. It's a special episode because we just passed a threshold where I can afford to have a professional studio. So I'm recording from Beacon Soundworks down the street from where I live, and my goal is to record in this professional sounding booth going forward. I can't tell you how hard it was to record in a closet in my hallway. It sounds very fun and do-it-yourself and back to basics, but after a few hours of cringing inside with the coats, hoping that I don't knock the wall and cause the sound to transfer to the microphone, it was getting a little stressful. Thank you for letting me go to the next level. So when people hear the word emulation, a bunch of ideas come to their head. For most people, I'm sad to say, it's simply the ability to play old video games on your modern system for free. For some, it's the ability to take one or two old home computer programs and also bring them to life. But the pure power of emulation is how much more than that it can be. And there's about 1,000 different ways to tell the emulation story, so I'm going to stick with one that's more personally oriented towards how it came into my life. I think the first time I was truly aware that emulation was at play was a program called Soft PC by Insignia Solutions that came out for the Macintosh. This was about 1989. And with Soft PC, you could put an MS-DOS window on your Mac. Just another window right there next to the other applications. And it had the prompt, it had the look and the feel, and you could put data on it and interact with it in every way as if it was an MS-DOS machine with a tiny little window on your desktop. This was mind-blowing to me. I just didn't understand how any of it worked, but the fact that you could even put a floppy disk in and read from it on your Mac, just pure necromancy. So I knew that existed, so I knew the technology existed. What I hadn't known is that emulation had been with computers almost since the beginning. As computers shifted from hardware to hardware, you needed the ability to run the software that had worked just a month ago or a year ago on your new version of the machine. And clever developers had created cards or software packages that allowed you to run that old software. So emulation was kind of floating in as simply as file operations or being able to write to the screen. Turns out that there was actually a very strange emulator that came out for the ColecoVision. It was a Atari 2600 player. You'd click it into the side of a ColecoVision, and then you could put in real Atari cartridges and play them. There was an enormous storm about this at the time. I mean, imagine any case where the competitor just puts in a little tiny patch and suddenly they ate your lunch and the plate too. The next time I really paid attention to anything like this happening was a program called Williams Arcade Classics for the PlayStation. This was something that allowed you to play Defender, Joust, Stargate, Bubbles, a number of Williams arcade machines on your PlayStation. Again, black magic. What was really cool about it was that when it started up in the same way that I remember the Williams machines starting when I found the power switch on them at the arcade. I loved turning them off, turning them on, and seeing the patterns that would go across the screen as it tested itself, letting you know the ROM and the RAM are okay, and then turning back into the game you knew. And here it was doing it as well on the PlayStation. You'd get everything that looked like you had booted up an arcade machine inside of your PlayStation. And then, for me, came the rise of the single machine emulators, although at the time we just called them emulators. They were these programs that you would download, download some sort of ROM that was available somewhere. You'd have to figure that out. And when you started it up, your home computer was playing an arcade game. And I think what's really something I try to get across to people is, arcade machines, especially early 1980s ones, are mind-numbingly simple. They had limited palettes of colors. They had limited amounts of sprites. They were basically designed to play that game and do nothing else in the world. But to us, who had lived through it, they were these portals to another world. So if you had something like Pac-Man, which had just a limited color set, a number of sprites, and the ability to play Pac-Man, and suddenly it was running on your home computer, even one that was made 2 decades later, it seemed like an insurmountable amount of power to be able to do so. I think a lot of it comes down to power, really. I mean, once the single emulators became multiple emulators, being able to play not just Pac-Man or Dig Dug, but being able to play all the Atari machines of the same family, or being able to play sets of families of arcade machines, we started to change our relationship to these early programs. They weren't just something you had to beg, borrow, and steal to get the quarters for, or to buy from the store. They were something that you could own and collect and keep on a disc and keep comprehensively. And I think the relationship changed there. I mean, it's one thing to walk to the arcade, go up to a machine. The machine is made out of heavy wood, and it's constructed of all of this beautiful hardware to give you the game experience before you even put a quarter in. And then you give it a little bit of money, and suddenly it wants to pay attention to you. This machine cares about you. So once you turn it down into a small zip of ROMs and you're interacting with it as just another program, and then you realize there's a menu that lets you choose from dozens or hundreds or tens of thousands of programs just like it, the relationship is 100% different. I mean, let's just take my own story of how I bought Space Invaders for the Atari 2600 to be able to get the $30 together to afford a Space Invaders cartridge. I had the Combat cartridge for the Atari 2600, and I really wanted to double my games library. And I chose Space Invaders. The cover art was amazing, and I loved Space Invaders in the arcade, and the idea of paying once and then playing infinite games of Space Invaders. All I had to do was literally gather up my pennies. I remember I was gathering quarters from couches, from the change drawer. I remember getting my hands on a few dollars here and there, and then proudly going down to a store that had a Space Invaders cartridge for sale, buying it, taking it back, plugging it in, and feeling like I owned Space Invaders. Now, if you've ever played Space Invaders for the Atari 2600, nothing about this game deserves this level of love from a 12-year-old, but there you have it. And now Space Invaders is just a 2K ROM that just sits among all the other ROMs on my hard drive or up at the archive, and you can just play it anytime. So what I'm saying is the relationship is complicated, and made even more complicated by the addition of the multi-arcade machine emulator, MAME, which has now passed 20 years of existence and has had hundreds of people working on it. Really smart, really clever people, with a set of ethics and approach to doing the emulator that has made it extensible, educational, and incredibly useful. If you go into the code of MAME, it's not just a case of seeing how it makes the joystick move. There's often circuit diagrams done in ASCII, or lists of how the thing works, or trivia and knowledge about the company that made this particular machine type or this particular arcade game. It's a learning experience more than a program. But it does the part where you play the games incredibly well, and with so much extensibility. So fast forward to 2011, Brewster has said to me, boy, it would really be great if we could play software like we currently play movies and music and everything else. And I just thought, well, then we ought to make MAME come up in the browser. We don't really have enough time in this podcast to go into the years of work and who did what when and everywhere else, but I do want to shout out to a few people. But I will say that on the very first day that I announced it would be a really neat idea to port MAME to JavaScript, Dopefish Justin came out of the woodwork and helped so much with this entire project from day one to day yesterday. He's been there all the way through with advice and programming skill. Dozens of others who have come in, helped, given advice. This project is not a case of me. Unfortunately, because of the way things kind of shook out, there's this kind of narrative of Jason Scott made MAME go into the browser. Jason did not. Jason simply screamed that it was a good idea for so long that people thought it might be a good idea and decided to experiment along with him. I never touched the code. I never did the programming. It's the skill of others. I'm proud to say that I was able to, in some ways, guide a team of people, but it was the talent of those people that made it come to be. And those people were working on top of the talent of the hundreds of people who had worked on MAME. This whole single person creating a miracle in a basement is just not the case here. Why did I choose JavaScript? Well, JavaScript is the classic example of worse is better. It did things okay, and as a result, it was in every browser on every platform in the modern era, which meant that if you were able to code something in JavaScript, it would run automatically cross-platform. There have been all sorts of attempts to put programs inside of browsers. Java, Knackle, Silverlight, and a billion others I'm glad to say I can't remember the names of. But all of these were done with an intent of locking people into a specific browser, or locking them onto a specific machine type, or locking them into some sort of control system in the case of Java, where one party, one company would decide all the rules. JavaScript scraped and bumped and fell along and became powerful in the absence of any of those interests. The code name of the project was the JavaScript mess, JS mess, for months and months and months, trying to get the program to even sort of run in a loop within JavaScript after being compiled in by the Emscripten program. After, about a year, we were able to get Smurfs for the ColecoVision to run at 25% in the browser. I remember tearing up that day as it happened, and I was playing a terrible, crappy, broken, but still able to be recognized copy of Smurfs in my browser, which meant that it could be played in any browser, which meant it could be played anywhere around the world. I could see everything that was going to happen when this happened. We had it up to 100% within a month. We started to have multiple programs running in the browser. Soon we had dozens. Soon we had hundreds. We were able to get the computer emulation to work. We were able to get the arcade emulation to work. So over the course of years, we started to introduce machines to the world. Some of them had fallen into obscurity. Some of them were at the top of everyone's list of their favorites. And the Internet Archive was able to just run them. So here we are in the present day. Millions of people have visited the Internet Archive's emulation. People are playing it right this very second. I can tell you that the Oregon Trail that is sitting on the Internet Archive is run every 8 seconds. I know there are elementary schools that depend on it as part of their curriculum to teach students. I know that there are people who made programs in the 1980s who have written us because they have found their old programs up on the archive, running just like they used to, and that they themselves don't even have copies. I know that this has changed the relationship of people to old software. It used to be that you had to, at least in some way, download the stuff, bring it up, go through it, split it apart, bring it into your emulator, interact with it. The fact that it's all one click now means that it stops being a process and stops being some sort of project, and it turns into just another media item. Something you study, something you play with, something you compare other items to. You can do it anywhere in the world on a modern browser instantly. Now, let's be clear. I'm happy right here. I'm happy where we are now. The emulation works. The experience of having an old machine in a window on your modern machine or on your phone still feels like magic to me. I know exactly how it works now. I've spent years of my life studying it, and it still feels wonderful. Just in the last year, we put up a version of Mac emulation using a second emulator, and I'll tell you that the Macintosh 9-inch screen, the black and white 1-bit graphics, when they came up alive on the archive, I remember I just felt so much pride for everybody involved that these old yet wonderful pieces of computer folk art were coming alive again and could play a part in the modern conversation. But what next? I mean, the miracle of emulators in the browser will soon become a generic background fact of life. We're living now with the miracle of emulators in the browser, just like we're living with the miracle of hard drives and the way that they function, or the miracle of the internet itself. So where are we going with this? What happens next? Well, here's my thoughts. There are a new class of emulators that are coming out that are variations on the original themes and are giving you powers as a person who runs them to interact with the programs in ways that just were never there before. You know, there's abilities to pull the sprites out in real time or see where the memory goes. There was an emulator demonstrated this summer that I saw called IE, which enabled you to see in real time the memory map of an Apple II, and it was constantly taking recording of the state of memory such that you could scrub back and forth to see how the entire machine was running across time. It was generating literally a recording of the computer's operation. You know, these powers where you'll be able to see how choices were made or be able to do manipulation in real time, this is what's coming down the road. There is a wonderful emulator out there called Octalyzer, where they are trying to build an entire educational system, multi-user and with shared resources for kids, but with the paradigm of an Apple II that has been turned into some sort of gargantuan V'ger-like machine. And my hope is that the archive will do the same, adding the ability to do screenshots, adding the ability to export and import file systems so that you'll be able to write something in a browser window in a word processor and both print it and save it for later. MAME already has support for memory state saves, so it's possible in MAME on the desktop to bring yourself up to a Pac-Man game just before it glitches out and play it and experience it for yourself instead of, losing 5 years of your life. We want to do that in the browser as well. We want the ability to take a machine that's emulated and make it into a machine that never existed. Let me explain. There's a demo out there, and the demo scene, I'll probably go into that in depth at some point, but you have these programs that are meant to impress other people, and a program came out called Pimp My Spectrum. The ZX Spectrum was a relatively low-powered machine that was beloved, especially in Europe, that has a wide range of programs, 20,000 of which are on the archive. And a group created a emulator for the Spectrum on a Windows platform that had attributes that no Spectrum ever had. They added 6 channels of sound. They added interaction with the 3D hardware. They basically created a super Spectrum, made it into an emulator, and that emulator plus the program are 64K on a Windows box. It's a technical masterpiece. But what fascinated me was that they then wrote a demo in that never-before-seen machine. The fact that they were able to code in music and graphics that just didn't exist in any way, shape, or form before that emulator fascinates me. I want to see more of this. I want to see that sort of kit bashing taking place with vintage machines. I mean, imagine an Apple that is reading Atari information and portraying it through some sort of filter to work on the Apple, or a DOS box that can suddenly access a gigabyte of memory. What weird things will come that we never knew existed before, and how amazing will that be? maybe even to a kid who thought that Pac-Man was the beginning, the middle, and the end. 'Cause emulation is magic. You've been listening to Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. I'm Jason Scott. Huge thanks to James Bekoyanu, Sam Johnston, Stefan Arnetz, Astrid Smith, Kevin Waters, and the hundreds of other Patreons who have been contributing to getting my debt paid down and telling you a bunch of stories that mean something to me and that I hope mean something to you. If you're hearing this all for the first time, my Patreon is at patreon.com/textfiles. My Twitter account is textfiles. My site is textfiles.com. And I thank you so much for letting me express myself this way. See you next week.